All right, let's just do it. Hello and welcome to Office Hours, where we answer questions, give philosophical perspectives, formulate and explore arguments, and deep dive into particular topics of your choice. Ian writes, is there meaning to life? Specifically, he wants me to address Jordan B Peterson at the 2018 University of Toronto debate. We'll put debate in quotes between him, Pamela Goldstein, and William Lane Craig. This is a classical philosophy question. This is the question that introduced me to philosophy when I was in like third grade. And my dad would tell me a little bit about philosophy. It's like, oh, people ask questions like, what is the meaning of life? And I always thought, and then you get introduced to Monty Python and the meaning of life. And you're like, oh, this is the question. And then you learn like a tiny bit about philosophy. And you're like, this is a bad question, which is what philosophy is a lot of times. And this is actually a very great debate because Jordan Peterson, who I've said critical things about in the past, actually I thought did very well here. And William Lane Craig he just did William Lane Craig. He did exactly what he does at his other debates. He said exactly the same things that he said in his famous debate with Christopher Hitchens at what was the private school university you went to there? I don't remember offhand. Anyways, and no one cared about what Pamela Goldstein had to say. I listened to about 5 minutes of her just talking about herself, and then I skipped the rest of everything she had to say in her debate. It didn't seem very interesting, and all the comments were amusingly about how impressive it was for a woman to be able to speak so much and to say so little. So hopefully I didn't miss anything important there. But what's up with this question? Peterson, I think, gives a very good introduction to the analysis of the question. Oh, and he gets up to speak. The first thing he does is he attacks the question, and he compares it to a variety of other bad questions in psychiatry, apparently, like, why are people anxious? And he says, that's not a good question. The real question is, given the world we live in, why isn't everybody always, like, paralytically anxious all the time? And he says, what's the meaning of life? Or does life have meaning? Or does it have significance? We'll get to the word meaning here in a little bit. It is also a dumb question. He says, you can never ask that of a person in pain, because pain is their meaning. Pain is their significance. And I mean, not to compare myself to people in tremendous pain, but on the still kind of recovering from this lingering cold. It's like the mildest but most annoying cold. Even a mild cold kind of makes it hard to think about other things. It draws your attention back to itself, as this important thing to deal with, the phlegm in your lungs or whatever. And so Jordan Peterson says pain is important. So the question is not, is there meaning to life? The question is there positive meaning to counterbalance the objective negative meaning of the pain that is existence? And this is something I've written about and talked about elsewhere, slightly critically. I think it's a bad foothold to start a philosophical exploration on, with the idea that life is pain at a fundamental metaphysical level. It might be a symptom of something, not a good first step, but a respectable philosophical position, and one worth taking seriously. It's the criticism of that would be more Nietzschean and less like bad logic or anything like that. And so, and Jordan Peterson gives a fairly good, I thought, account of the of how positive meaning can arise for individuals, and went on to, I think, a little bit baffle-garbly, but generally coherently defend a naturalistic explanation of how meaning or significance, we might say, or importance. We'll come to a better word actually than that. Can arise from a purely naturalistic frame, because basically what William Lane Craig was doing, which is again exactly what he did in his debate with Christopher Hitchens, which if you haven't seen that, it is worth watching. It's one of the best debates on YouTube, I think, in terms of just learning how to do a formal debate and construct a formal argument. William Lane Craig is a master. He is excellent at that. I disagree with everything he says, but it's really, really hard not to respect him. He is phenomenal at what he does, and his arguments they're good arguments. You know, you can't just dismiss them out of hand. But where was I? Peterson. Oh yes. William Lane Craig is basically trying to concern troll the non-Christian audience, basically, saying, look, we're not talking about whether or not God exists, but he's trying to argue that if there is no God, then there is no meaning. There's no significance. And he makes this argument that, everything we know about physics says we're all going to die, not just in our own lifetimes, but like cosmically, our universe is going to come to an end. And the fact that things will end means that there is no significance to anything. And so there's no reason to have hope or to have any sense of significance. And he actually goes so far as to say it is not possible for an atheist, or I guess he might concede this with other religious believers, but for a non-monotheist to be both happy and consistent, which is like the most concern trolling argument ever. And it hinges upon, and this is a very coherence theory of truth worldview thing, the idea that everybody does or ought to build their worldview in a philosophically constructive fashion from first principles upward on this scaffolding of logic, as though we can't know anything until we articulate it into some kind of axiom. And there are people who actually think this, but I don't think anybody who goes to the world without trying to beat other people in debate does this. And we'll get to... Actually, I'll jump to it right now. I thought the most telling quote... I was taking a bunch of notes on what Craig was saying until I heard Peterson's response. I'm like, oh, most of these are not relevant. Peterson did, I thought, a phenomenal job of ridiculing the timeline point. But at one point, William Lane Craig says, there's no... If you don't believe in God, then there's no one to say that you are right and I am wrong. End quote. In other words, there's no arbiter you can appeal to justify yourself to the crowd, I guess. And I think that's really revealing. That is actually very appealing to a lot of people. But if you think about it, you're like, why do I need to know that I'm right or wrong according to God or something in this way? It's actually an appeal to social consensus. It's not actually like an appeal to truth. I mean, like, obviously we would like to be right in an objective sense, but the desirability of it doesn't necessarily mean it is the case. But notice that the emotional appeal is in social. You want to be approved or disapproved, perhaps, in the eyes of someone else, society, perhaps. And this coincides with an argument I made in Descending Odin's Throne, and elaborated on a little bit in an essay coming out later this year, about how the desire for objective truth is actually a desire for social control. And this has very, very deep origins in blood feuds and the destruction of blood feuds. And so people came up with a system of third-party arbitration that became our concept of law and juries and so forth. And objective truth and the idea of a reasonable person being one with good intentions is all wrapped up in this idea of objectivity. And law and philosophy are actually connected at a very deep level if you go back to Homer, but especially to Aeschylus, and to a degree like Sophocles with Antigone as well. So, anyways, there's a the desire of objective truth. I thought it was a funny, slight mask slip with Dr. Craig. Not that Dr. Craig is arguing disingenuously or anything like that. I just think it's an example of one of these very slippery, easy traps people can fall into. But let's refocus. Let's go back, speaking of traps and language, to this word meaning. Does life have meaning? And the participants, Dr. Craig and also Dr. Peterson, and I assume Pamela Goldstein as well, although I didn't listen to her individual speech. I heard her back and forth with the other participants, and I wish I could cut that part out too. But they use some very, very distinct words, more or less interchangeably. I would say meaning is one, significance was another. I think someone used purpose, but one that should have been used, that was not used here, is desirable. Does life have meaning? Is actually not the same question as does life have significance, which is also different from and separate from does life have purpose, which is finally also different and separate from is life desirable. Does life have meaning is a grammatically ambiguous question. It's actually just a clumsy question. Does life have significance is the question that Dr. Craig was trying to get to with his, like, it's all going to end. And like the question that was coming to my mind is like, suppose human life was guaranteed to continue into infinitude. So what you did in your own life would be overshadowed by literally infinite generations to come. Has your life as an individual now acquired more significance than it would have had? Really? It doesn't feel that way to me, you know. But there's a subtle equivocation here too between objective significance, which was ostensibly what Dr. Craig was talking about. Is there an actual significance to your life regardless of how you feel about it? Is there actually some impact or whatever? And that's a little different than whether it feels like it has significance. I can't speak for everybody, but I know I have been in situations where, I understand that, the work I'm doing for a particular company is important to someone else. I understand conceptually that it's significant. It was actually quite significant in one case. Man, it did not feel significant. And maybe it was just because it was a desk job. But the feeling of significance can be very different from the conceptual, theoretical idea of whether something is objectively significant or not. So there's meaning, which is like interpretability, I suppose, which is different from, we'll say, capital S significance, which is like, is it objectively significant, versus the feeling of significance. Does it feel meaningful to you? And that's different from purpose. Is there a destiny? Is there a telos to life or to your life? Is there a certain thing you are supposed to be doing? A duty of sorts. And finally, and that can actually be different than capital S significance or lower S significance. I'm reminded of the Rick and Morty scene of the robot that's made to transport pancakes or something. It's like, that is its purpose. And the robot's just like, like, not all purposes are necessarily significant or desirable. And that brings us to the last one, which is desirability. And I think that's maybe what the question is secretly hiding behind everything else. Because we could imagine circumstances where a life has purpose but is not desirable. So you're like Frodo taking the ring to Mount Doom, right? Purposeful, very significant, has meaning, and in the sense of it, like there's a story, may even have a sense of personal significance. Not desirable, not fun. Now, desirable can be a little bit more complicated than just hedonistic, right? Because the sense of significance is oftentimes more important to us than pleasure, But still, desirability is an interesting category that I didn't hear mentioned, and we could think of situations where maybe you don't have an objective purpose. Maybe you don't have some like capital S significance, but your life is still desirable. Maybe you still want to do it. There was a story in the headlines about a guy who, this is from a few years ago. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a funny anecdote. Anyways, the guy was planning on committing suicide. So before he took his own life, he decided to travel down to Latin America and just blow a few $1,000s on drugs and hookers. And after a couple weeks of doing that, said, "You know what? I actually don't think I want to take my own life. I think I'll keep doing this for a little while." he didn't. Not life advice, obviously. But it was just a funny anecdote about how you like, again, there's a separation between the concept of meaning or significance or purpose and the feeling of meaning, significance, purpose. So, the question, does life have a meaning, I think is code and is hides a much deeper, maybe scarier question underneath it. Albert Camus, the French existentialist, said there's only one serious philosophical question, and that is, should we kill ourselves? The slightly nicer way of putting that is, is life worth living? Is life desirable? And all the meaning and significance and purpose is just dressing up of the question of, should we carry on living? Is life worth living? And this is going to vary. The feeling of life is going to vary from person to person. But in my experience, how life feels has very, very, very little to do with the conceptual constructs you have created or discovered or been told about. It has a lot more to do with what you're doing with your body and your relationships with other people. Are you moving? Are you being outside? Do you have good friendships? And it sounds like we're departing from the domain of philosophy here a little bit, and maybe we are, but there is, I think, when you get down and drill through, what is this question actually getting at? What are we really trying to get to when we talk about the meaning of life question? And this is not just, this is not just Camus. This goes back to one of my favorite Bible books, actually, Ecclesiastes, which is basically everything Dr. Craig is saying. It is a biblical book that is a thought experiment about what would life be like in a world without God, which is euphemistically described as the world under the sun. And in chapter 2, I believe, someone check me on this, of Ecclesiastes, the king says that, and I beheld the men buried, in the ground, or dead, and thought they were better off than the living, for they did not have to endure the evil that was done under the sun. But better still were those who were not yet born, or who would not be born. And this, of course, is brought up. There's a lot of Nietzsche references by both Craig and by Peterson. Craig actually read the entire parable of the madman thing. I think Nietzsche would be rolling his eyes a little hearing a Christian use this in this way. But and Peterson has done this too in other contexts. I'm sorry, where was I going? I scripted most of this, but not all the way. We were talking about desire. Oh yes, Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy brings up the wisdom of Silenus, which is that King Mithridates, Midas, one of the ancient Persian or Greek kings, captured this great centaur, old wise man, maybe a drunk man, who knows. Said, what is the greatest wisdom of life? And Silenus says, "Oh, poor mortal, born for a day, the greatest thing is beyond you, and that is to never have been born. But the second best thing is to die, and die soon." And again, so the Greeks were familiar with this question going back quite some time, and Nietzsche was familiar with this question from the very beginnings of his writings about philosophy. And his thesis in The Birth of Tragedy, contrary to what Craig is saying about Nietzsche, is that the Greeks, who are his model of beauty and excellence and vivacity and just everything good in life, was that the Greek model of the gods is actually a statement of their embrace of life. That for all its suffering, life is so good that even the gods live it in this strange soap operatic life on Mount Olympus, where people are cheating on each other and there's drama and all this, like, otherwise very petty, what we would call mundane stuff. And there's a competitive, vital energy to the Greek world that was, Nietzsche thought, a symptom of vital energy and of health. And the answer to all of this stuff is actually just being healthy. Just being healthy. If you are healthy and if you are doing something that is challenging and connects you with other people, if you have good connections with other people, these questions are not going to haunt you. It's taking Peterson's point about challenging the question one step further. Like, life is worth living, like, obviously. The need to justify life, the feeling that perhaps life ought to have some kind of justification, is itself a symptom of maybe not being in a good place. And you'll hear people say, you'll hear Peterson saying, life is suffering, and he's like deeply connected with Solzhenitsyn and all this stuff. That is not universal. That is projecting. And there's a lot of people who do experience a tremendous amount of suffering in their life. And some of it is beyond our control. Absolutely. I myself have been fairly fortunate in my life. But also, there are people who deeply, profoundly enjoy life, and for whom the suffering is like, spice on the top of hearty, healthy substance, not the substance itself of life. Peterson is a type of person that Nietzsche would call a decadent. A decadent is someone who is excessively sensitive. And by the way, Nietzsche categorized himself in this group as well. Nietzsche said that he was also a decadent. He says this in Ecce Homo. So one has to, and the great spiritual triumph of Nietzsche, maybe, you may or may not believe this, but is arguably Nietzsche thought he overcame his own decadent tendencies at great effort, with great with great intention and force of will, and probably only partially, because who can completely overcome that? But Peterson has that too. He's intensely sensitive. This is why he cries on stage. It's not fake, I don't think, anyways. I think he's actually experiencing these emotions with great intensity. I don't know if he was traumatized as a kid. He describes some pretty traumatic things, some pretty odd dreams if you read Maps of Meaning. He's a very odd character, but I wouldn't, and this is not to discount his work, because he's done some good work, but I would not take his view of the substance of life as necessarily a guideline for yourself. And if you do feel that you are maybe in that decadent direction, someone who, because you experience things so intensely, the pain of life actually makes the meaning of life into a serious question. God, what is the meaning of life? Can I actually be happy without God? Maybe not. Maybe Dr. Craig is right. Or maybe you would feel a lot better if you were healthier physically and had more and better and higher quality relationships with people who matter to you in your life. So I think what we are after is the feeling of significance, the feeling of purpose, the feeling of desirability, not the concept of significance, not the concept of purpose, not the concept of desirability. And we can think about this in the reverse. Imagine an addict, right? If you tell them, hey man, I don't know if you knew this, but drugs are bad. Be like, yeah, I'm well aware when he's so in his sober moments. That doesn't stop him from doing the bad behavior, though. He's an addict. He is a slave to this hijacked drive in his brain. He's very aware that what he's doing is not good. But that knowledge doesn't move him any closer to the goal of sobriety or being clean. And in the same way, what we're after is not the knowledge of significance, the knowledge of purpose. It's the feeling of purpose, the feeling of significance, which again, we don't even need to put into words if we're feeling it, because the question is not relevant. So, and the way to reach that place is not directly through philosophy, although philosophy, in my experience, can connect you with some pretty cool people, and it can guide you to the right path. That right path is actually not just thinking harder. It is, and this is where Jordan Peterson was amusingly right. And I shouldn't be going on and on about how right Jordan Peterson is in this debate, although broadly speaking he was in rare high form. He did make one interesting mistake, I think, and it was a very clean mistake. It was an understandable one, but he, at one point in attempting to refute Craig, while granting some points about objective evil, he said, and of course, if there's objective evil, that implies that there's an objective good too. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. There can be objective evil and no objective good, which is actually my position. I believe in objective evil. I believe there is a singular, like, funneled down spirit of destruction for the sake of destruction. Spite. It's very close to ressentiment that Nietzsche describes. But an objective good does not follow logically as necessary from this spirit. First of all, in most cases, most opposite pairings, most binaries, are human constructs and don't correspond in the real world. For example, if I were to ask you, what's the opposite of a Nazi, right, in a political context? The opposite of a Nazi. Is it a communist? Well, they have some things in common. Are they? Is it absolutely the same? I'm not sure. What's the opposite of a communist? Is it a libertarian? The libertarians would say so. But maybe, then the Nazis come in and say, oh, they're two wings of the same. We won't get into that thing. But there are even similarities there, too. Did you know libertarians and Marxists both share an idealization of freedom? They really do. I'm getting phone calls. I'll finish up. So anyways, I think the heart of this question, does life have meaning, is that it's actually a question about the desirability of life in disguise. And when you dig past the language, we're not even in the domain of philosophy anymore. We're in the domain of your body, your health, and your social connections with others. How do you feel? And so I hope that partially answers the question. It might be obnoxiously untheological, but I've been in this domain of theology for a very long time. There's a lot of mentions of Kant in this discussion. And actually, Craig did a very good job of pointing out an equivocation between transcendental argumentation, which is what Kant does, and transcendence as a reference to something supernatural. Both Peterson and Goldstein were taking a naturalist position. So, anyways, there's a lot to think about here, but that's my take on, does life have meaning? One, it's a bad question, and two, it's a disguise for the question that everyone's been talking about since the beginning of time, which is, should we, Hamlet, to be or not to be? And I think the answer is very much to be, but get there by being healthy and having good relationships with people. So, anyways, thanks so much for listening. Take care.